Hello and welcome to the UK CIF Leadership Podcast. It's Oscar here on day 7 of COP26, discussing UK leadership on the just transition. We're really pleased to be joined by Nick Robbins. Nick is a professor in practice for sustainable finance at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. He's our first speaker for our podcast today. We'll later be speaking to the Rathbone Greenbank Investments sustainability team, Kate, Elliot, and Sophie Lawrence. So Nick, let's get straight into it, if that's all right. It'd be really good to hear perhaps about some of your recent priorities, including your work helping lead the Financing a Just Transition Alliance at the Institute. Thanks.
Yeah, it's really good to be with you, Oscar. I think what's happened over the last year is that as investors and governments and others have got more serious about net zero, the question has really arisen, sort of, well, how are we going to deliver it? It's fine to have these 2050 targets, but how are we going to deliver that? And as soon as you start thinking about that, you start thinking about the implications for people. And that's what the Just Transition is all about. It's all about, as it says in the Paris Agreement, to ensure as we move towards a net zero resilient economy, we think about the interests of workers. So we're delivering decent jobs, the new jobs in the green economy are decent. We're also thinking about potential for vulnerabilities for workers and communities as we move away, so as sort of to avoid stranded workers, stranded assets. And we're also trying to, so as we're calling it, so I think, shape the shift so that not only to deliver these net zero goals, but we use that transformational moment to really power ahead with the S of ESG. So it's lots of momentum that's happening. And as you mentioned, the Financing a Just Transition Alliance, it's a UK body, about 40 organisations, number of UCSIF members, UCSIF a member itself, banks, got the British Business Bank involved, the TUC, regional bodies, academics, and so on. And it's really saying, well, how do we take this sort of very high-level concept and drive it through into practical things that investors can do with their portfolios? And so our report, Just Zero, came out last week, and I think got a really good response on the back of the government's net zero strategy. And in the UK, I suppose, in a sense, the message in a political sense is sort of net zero plus levelling up equals just transition. So it's very much about how we join these agendas, which are often, sadly, disconnected, and therefore has a very big focus on place and region and so on. We've also just released another piece with a more global focus and looking at how investors and others can really promote the Just Transition as we shift away from coal. So this was with the Powering Past Coal Alliance, and that's obviously going to be a big theme for COP, and particularly for developing countries, which often are still very, very coal-based. So again, how do we move away from coal, accelerate the transition, but do that in a way which actually is net positive in terms of impact for workers and communities?
That's great. Thanks very much, Nick. You mentioned the first report, which UK CIF was very pleased to contribute to as a member of the Alliance. And, for those of us listening in, many of them will be members of UK CIF. Just to give a bit of an overview on some of the main takeaways, in that report, Nick, would be really interesting to hear, I'm sure, for many of those tuning in.
Yeah, so the report, as I said, looked at how we translate this sort of high-level imperative into practical action. There are recommendations for institutions, which I'll go into, and then also policy recommendations, particularly what governments need to do, with a particular focus in the UK on the regional implications. And again, the message is that Just Transition is not a separate subject. It's part of your overall approach to climate and sustainability, and indeed would apply equally to dealing with issues such as biodiversity as just dealing with issues such as climate. So the 5 recommendations for finance institutions is make sure that Just Transition is in your strategy. A number of investment companies have put Just Transition in terms of their responsible investment policies, their climate policies, and so on, and obviously signal that down the chain, particularly if you're an asset owner. The second, obviously, is incorporate that into your stewardship and engagement activities. The report actually highlights some very nice examples where UK investors, Royal London Asset Management, Friends Providence, have been engaging with companies, utility companies. As a result of that, the utility SSE came forward with a first plan on Just Transition, and again, has just recently updated that to show what they're doing, particularly in terms of what that means for their workers. So again, I think it's a good example seeing that Just Transition can be quite a positive way of engaging with companies. Third is then capital allocation. Obviously, we want to think about particular assets. And so the fourth area for investor action is policy dialogue, engaging with governments to put in place the frameworks. Clearly, investors are engaging a lot with governments on what's needed on the on climate policy and so on. And similarly, investors can engage and are engaging. In fact, we sent a letter to the Prime Minister on what investors need to see in terms of just transition. So that would be in terms of skills policy, the Green Jobs Task Force, in terms of regional policy, and also in terms of particular initiatives to make the just transition come alive. And we've promoted the idea of a just transition commission based on the experience in Scotland, which really shows how the sort of different voices from across society, from across regions, can really be channeled in so we get effective action. So that was the fourth area.
That's great. Thanks very much, Nick. It'd be great to turn to perhaps some of the policy recommendations outlined in the report. At UK SIF, we strongly support the call for a UK Just Transition Commission based on, as you say, Scotland's experience, to really bring about a bit of clarity and consensus on, what should be the key components that constitute a just transition? How do we prioritise certain points over others? And how could a commission actually help, identify the priorities for different policy areas that align with the UK government's current levelling up agenda? So yeah, Nick, a bit of an overview for those of us listening in on the policy recommendations would be great.
Yeah, well, let's start with the Just Transition Commission. So, famously, whenever there's a problem in the UK, you set up a committee or a commission. So it's not designed to be a sort of bureaucratic quango, but it really to, I think, be a practical place where business and trade unions and investors and regions and policymakers and so on can really sort of come together on a sort of a common view about how we make sure that the net zero climate transition deals effectively with this issue of fairness, which is the just transition, of inclusion, and does it across the country. So one of the things I think would be very useful for the Just Transition Commission would be to highlight where the just transition factors and priorities fit in terms of different sectoral roadmaps. Clearly, we need to move ahead on housing and buildings, on the energy sector, on agriculture, on industry. And clearly, let's say the energy sector, we've got a very positive transition going on in the North Sea with offshore wind growing. We also have the inevitable decline of offshore oil and gas. So clearly, that would be a place where you could have a sector focus, really putting focus on the just transition. And similarly, the building sector, again, we're going to need to really recruit huge numbers of workers for that retrofit sector. Again, how do we ensure that those jobs are good jobs, they're skilled, that these really connect with community priorities and so on. So I think the just transition can really help on those sort of identifying sector priorities. And then also, I think, bringing this regional dimension. This will be very different if you're going to be in the Yorkshire and Humber region, or if you're going to be in rural regions or metropolitan London. So our experience, again, we heard from Jim Skee, who's the chair of the Scottish Just Transition Commission, and he actually said it did add value, because obviously in the UK we already have the really good Climate Change Committee, which has a lot of analysis and holds government to account. But the Just Transition Commission would be slightly different because it's more multi-stakeholder, more regional, and so on. So it would add value. There are other recommendations we can go in as well. I think particularly thinking about the role that sort of public finance can play to help private capital. We have the new UK Infrastructure Bank with a net zero and local sort of development goal. Again, how can that be an anchor institution? British Business Bank has been really ramping up its work on SMEs. And again, that's an area for just transition across the country. And then this area of green sovereign bonds. So we've had the first couple of green sovereign bonds in the UK, a commitment to social co-benefits. But I think going forward, that green sovereign bond tool could be really used to be focusing on particular just transition priorities.
Thanks very much, Nick, for that great overview. And it's good to see a lot of overlap between sort of our work and the institutes. And clearly a lot of our policy asks in this agenda have been reflected in the final report, which is great to see. So we've got very similar asks on things like incorporating social good benefits into the UK government's Green Gilts programme, and also having the Just Transition Commission. I suppose it makes sense for us to turn to COP26. And it'd be good to hear your thoughts, Nick, on what would be some of the good outcomes coming out of COP in delivering on the just transition agenda? And realistically, what can policymakers drive further forward here during COP?
Well, I think there are quite a few things sort of lined up for COP on just transition. Clearly, COP is hosted in the UK, but it's primarily a global agenda. So we'll see a ministerial declaration on just transition come out, I think, on the Energy Day, which again, I think highlights that as we drive ahead on net zero energy transition, just transition is key. We'll also see particular initiatives around financing. So climate finance, the 100 billion, really sad, shameful failure of industrialized countries to reach that 100 billion in climate finance in developing countries. But we'll actually see some specific examples where through the climate investment funds, public finance is being used to accelerate the phase out of coal and incorporating just transition. So that will be really good to see, with focus on India and South Africa. We'll also see, which I think is really helpful, an initiative coming out of the corporate sector, because the just transition has been initiated by the labour movement. A number of countries have picked it up, investors are as well. But this is an initiative from the Council on Inclusive Capitalism, working with the Vatican, with Cardinal Turkson, and also chaired by Bernard Looney, the CEO of BP. And they'll be coming through with their framework on a just energy transition, a number of CEOs behind that. So again, I think that is another sign that as we get serious about implementation on net zero, the just transition becomes a question of the how. How do we do this in terms of the people dimension? So that will be coming through as well. And then we'll be having a launch actually of the Just Zero report. One thing I think it is interesting looking across the COP is that the gender dimension of the transition will come up very, very strongly, which is really important to see. Clearly, the status quo at the moment, let's say in the energy sector, is very gender imbalanced, largely male. And this is where the just transition is an area where we can actually shape this transition so we actually get a much better outcome in terms of a much more gender balanced workforce.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Nick. And it's so good to see this issue featuring so prominently on the agenda at COP26 among everything else that is going on. I suppose one thing that we need to sort of collectively tackle, policymakers, industry regulators and others, is the sort of the politics of the just transition and combating this perception of the sort of costs of the transition. And I suppose, Nick, what are some of the things that you think we should be saying to policymakers during the COP summit to really improve their understanding of a just transition and why this really matters?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the evidence shows that not just is the transition necessary, but it's best framed in terms of an investment. So I think sometimes we use the words wrongly. So we need to invest in the net zero transition, and that will yield a whole series of returns: environmental returns, reduced emissions, health returns, improved human health, and for investors, investment returns, because these will be better long-term investments. And I think what has happened we're essentially in the second phase of the just transition narrative. The sort of first phase, it emerged at Paris. And then we had pretty quickly two shocking examples. We had President Trump pulling out of the US, largely talking about just transition, largely talking about the risk for coal jobs. And then we obviously had the Gilets jaunes protests in France about a sort of carbon tax. And I think policymakers and investors and corporates are listening. And actually, we've got the EU coming forward very strongly with just transition, Scotland within the UK, South Africa. And when Joe Biden talks climate, he talks jobs, jobs, jobs. So I think we're in that sort of second phase now, recognizing that unless we consciously design the sort of human dimension, workers, communities, suppliers, consumers, into policy design, we're inevitably going to get this backlash. And then all the risks we see with climate change are going to crystallize, and we're going to see those come to pass, unfortunately. So I think that narrative is now getting through, I think.
That's really promising to hear. And I suppose, the UK as the president of COP26, and also, I suppose, also through our experience of managing our own seismic economic transition in the 1980s, should perhaps, help the UK play a leadership role and making sure that the just transition is part of the kind of dialogue that we have with countries, at summits like COP, but then also the G7 and the G20. I suppose, Any reflections, Nick, on the sort of potential for a sort of a more active and robust kind of UK global leadership role on the just transition? It'd be interesting to hear what you make of that.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, sadly, the UK transition away from coal in the 1980s is seen as sort of almost what not to do. Obviously, that was a hugely political process, but essentially, we know it left huge scarring, economic and social scarring across the country, many of which the legacy is still with us today. And I think it's interesting reading through, but sort of in a sense across the political spectrum. Very interesting paper out of the Conservative Environment Network about the North Sea transition, very clearly from the Conservative point of view, highlighting we cannot repeat that with this transition. So in many ways, this is one of the first transitions we have the opportunity to consciously shape. All the evidence suggests that this will be more job rich. We can also make this good in terms of high quality jobs. Again, that's a narrative, certainly in the UK, that all parties are behind. I think the real question is then about sort of how we translate these desires for joining up into practical action. And again, I think that's something that investors can do very well. I think taking the initial examples of the investor engagement that's happened in the utility sector, taking that into mining, into oil and gas, the house builders, and indeed with banks, I would say, because banks will have an important role. I think by being very practical in terms of what they expect the sort of the companies they invest in are doing, that then evidence can come back to governments and saying, actually, governments, we need you to do this as well. We need you to do this in terms of skills policy, in terms of coordination through Just Transition Commission, in terms of regional policy, and so forth.
Thanks very much, Nick. We're coming towards the end of our podcast, unfortunately for today, but there's so much more, of course, we could have covered. But I suppose, Nick, leaving our members with any sort of, final messages for them in terms of how they can sort of practically integrate just transition considerations into their investment decisions and policies, or any sort of reports or separate to the Alliance's recent report, of course, that they may turn to going forward.
Well, of course, the first recommendation is to read the report, which you can find on our website. And what is nice to see is actually that UCSIF is a member, a number of other sort of investor associations are members. The Local Authority Pension Fund Forum has just come out with their report. And what is good is that it's not just a surprise that the recommendations are the same. So UCSIF recommendations and the recommendations of the Alliance, but it's a good thing. It's deliberately designed so we have a convergent set of recommendations, both for financial institutions, but also for the government. So it's very, very clear. And again, the key, I think, now is to sort of wake up on November the 15th, the Monday, hopefully COP will have finished by then, and really think as we move forward and accelerate, particularly in the UK on net zero strategy, that we're consciously putting in place this sort of social lens, as it were. And I think probably, I think the area to focus on would be the sort of emerging market developing country dimension of people's portfolios, whether those are the assets in UK listed assets, the sovereign bonds of emerging markets, or sort of assets that are held in listed companies in developing countries and so on. This is where the real test of the just transition will come, because actually these countries, because we've been so slow on climate change, will need to make the transition much quicker. And so making sure that climate action delivers on their development priorities will be absolutely essential. So perhaps that's the place to look next, I think, in terms of investor action.
Thanks very much, Nick. It's been a really terrific conversation. I've really enjoyed speaking to you about this, and we've covered so much ground. We'll shortly be speaking to representatives from Rathbone Greenbank Investments to continue this conversation. That's Kate, Elliot, and Sophie Lawrence. But for now, thanks very much, Nick.
Hello, it's James and Sally here to let you all know about our podcast sponsor.
This COP26 series of the UK CIF Leadership podcast is sponsored by Lion Trust. We're delighted to have them involved. Lion Trust is a specialist fund management company that was founded in 1995.
And as of July 2021, they had £34 billion in assets under management. Their aim is to have a positive impact on their investors, stakeholders, and society.
We're so pleased to have them on board for this series. Without the support of our partners, the podcast would not be able to happen.
So, without further interruption, let's get on with the episode.
Hello and welcome to part 2 of our UK CIF Leadership podcast on UK leadership on the just transition. This is the second part of our conversation following an excellent chat we had with Nick Robbins, the Professor in Practice for Sustainable Finance at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. For the second part of our discussion, we're joined by Kate Elliot and Sophie Lawrence from Rathbone Greenbank Investments, the sustainability arm of Rathbones. Kate and Sophie are members of Rathbone Greenbank Investments Sustainability Research Team, and they're here today to discuss their recent report on the just transition. Thanks so much, Kate and Sophie, for joining us for our conversation today. It's great to have you both here. I think it'd be good to start with your thoughts, perhaps, Sophie, on what do we actually mean when we're talking about a just transition?
Yeah, great. Thanks for inviting us onto this podcast. So it's definitely an important place to start. And really, when we're thinking about a just transition, it's about making sure that the benefits of a transition to a low carbon economy are being shared widely, whilst also supporting those who stand to lose economically from it. And we could be talking about this in terms of countries, regions, industries, communities, or workers. So, for example, if we take workers, it's about involving them and anticipating employment shifts, helping them to develop new skills and providing social protection. But then we could also think about it from a community perspective. And then when we think about that, it's really understanding what are going to be the spillover effects when we, for example, close a fossil fuel plant. And it might also be about enabling innovations such as community energy. And it's really important because as the transition picks up speed, the location of job losses and employment gains is receiving increasing attention. And we'll come on to see when we talk about our latest report, as well as to make sure that new green jobs are also quality jobs. So that's really what a just transition means to us at Greenbank.
That's really helpful to hear, Sophie, and great that you guys are doing this work as well, because the just transition means so many different things to so many different people and has so many different components. So anyone who's doing some work in the space to try and sort of bring a bit of clarity to this area, it's something that UK CIF and the team here very much welcome. You mentioned the report, Sophie, that was recently published. It'll be great to hear, perhaps from you, Kate, what are some of the main recommendations that you put forward in your report, and what are some of the practical steps that the sustainable finance sector can take to help embed just transition considerations into their decision making?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as Sophie mentioned, I think one of the key things with the just transition is that those social impacts aren't going to be felt in the same way, in the same place, kind of uniformly across the world, or even within regions of the same country. So what we set about doing with our report, we wanted to use the UK as a case study, and we wanted to look at the impact on jobs at different points. So kind of in the near term, looking at 2025, then 2030, and then out to the long term to 2050, and looking specifically at the green transition, so holding all those other mega trends like kind of demographic change and technological developments, holding all of those steady, but thinking, what are the industries at risk and what are the industries that are likely to grow, and where will the jobs arise out of that? And while we saw a really positive kind of overall picture that by 2050 we can see probably 500,000 new jobs created across the UK as a direct result of the green and low carbon transition, there are obviously a lot of job losses built into that. Net picture still overwhelmingly positive across every region, but we did identify some key actions for the investment community to take, just to really ensure that kind of we're not losing sight of the human impact of those job losses, and we're not kind of being blinded by statistics and just seeing, well, this is a kind of overall great picture, but we've lost those kind of human stories. And it's really important that, as with any big transition, you've got the right policies and planning and support built in so that we really can take account of those social impacts. And in our report, we set out 5 key recommendations for the investment community. So firstly, just begin by incorporating the just transition into your responsible investment strategies. Think about what that means in the context of your own approach to investment and how you might begin kind of thinking about it and integrating it. Look at ways that you can allocate capital to the communities that need it most. Again, that could vary by the financial institution, the type of investment that you're undertaking. For a bank, it might be direct investment into particular regions. It might be developing innovative products that really allow a much more localized approach to investment. We also looked at recommendations, of course, around engagement and stewardship. I think that's a really powerful role that everyone within the financial community, kind of big or small, can play with this, and really think about how they can nudge companies into the right direction, the right way of thinking, really taking into account kind of social responsibilities. Finally, our other recommendations were around due diligence into emerging green economy industries. I think it can often be the case that we get a little bit excited, we just focus on the environmental impacts, and we can't lose sight of the fact that we want to make sure kind of decent work is baked into these companies from the outset, so that as they grow, we get good quality jobs in addition to quantity. And then the final recommendation was really around just keeping a watching brief on the just transition. We know it's a complex issue. We know that it's going to develop in different ways over time, and it's important that investors and other stakeholders keep on top of it and are able to react to those developments as they emerge.
That's great. Thanks very much, Kate. You mentioned at one point the role of investor stewardship, and clearly that is going to be really important in ensuring a fair and just transition. Sophie, it'd be good to get your take. Have there been any good examples, today of positive engagement from the industry in this area? Clearly, there's a lot to be done, but yeah, interested to hear, are there any sort of recent good case studies, I suppose, of good stewardship in action?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I just wanted to take a step back, actually, because I will probably have some people listening where investor engagement isn't a term that everyone's familiar with. So just briefly, kind of what we mean by that. So shareholder engagement is the process by which we as investors in public companies can leverage our position as shareholders to influence corporate decision making. And this can really take various forms, from sort of informal meetings that we have with management, all the way through to kind of more formal measures such as filing shareholder resolutions. So as Kate mentioned, we can use this as a tool to make sure that companies are prioritizing a just transition. And really how we can do that practically is we can integrate the just transition into the engagement that we're having on a company's climate transition plans. So that can include us thinking about kind of workplace issues such as social dialogue, the training and skills and redeployment that a company is offering, as well as how they're managing their supply chain and community relations with respect to the just transition. And a really positive step we've seen recently is that Climate Action 100 Plus, which is the investor coalition, which is now, I think, 450 plus investors engaging with the global kind of highest carbon impact companies, has integrated a just transition component into what it's asking of companies throughout the engagement. But I also wanted to briefly mention, there's often this temptation to only think about the just transition in the context of the high carbon intensive sectors, which are definitely really important. But we also need to be thinking about it for a much broader range of industries. And one that we have been engaging with a lot in the last couple of years is social housing. So social housing, and sorry, not just social housing, but housing in the UK accounts for about 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. And we need to, as investors, ensure that any housing associations have viable decarbonisation strategies. But also we need to make sure that they're looking after their residents in the process. So Greenbank actually engaged with 20 social housing providers in the UK regarding their tenant wellbeing and energy performance. And we were early adopters of the Sustainable Reporting Standard for social housing, which was established in 2020 to address gaps in the transparency and comparability of ESG reporting. So this has been a really positive engagement for us. And following this engagement, 19 out of the 20 providers have now signed up to this reporting standard. And this is going to be really important, as it's going to be able to help investors like us think about how they're going to be taking the transition, going ahead with the transition and achieving reductions in emissions, all while protecting tenant wellbeing. And just briefly, another really positive engagement in this area has been the Financing a Just Transition Alliance, which was established by the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics. And this programme is really designed to identify the role that finance can play in connecting action on climate change with inclusive development and prioritising a just transition. And there's some really interesting reports on how investors can engage in this area through that work. So that's what I would say there. Really interesting work happening.
That sounds very promising, Sophie. And yeah, we were also very pleased to be members of the Alliance. Really pleased to contribute to their work. And I think they've got reports that will be launched during COP26, perhaps as we speak. Speaking of COP, we really should be talking about COP. Obviously, we're here on day 7 of COP26. Perhaps turning to UK, what are some of your expectations for policymakers at COP, in making progress on a just transition? Are there 1 or 2 positive outcomes that you think we could take out of COP to drive forward this agenda? Interested to hear your thoughts, Kate.
Yeah, firstly, I think very important to remember that just transition is included in the text of the Paris Agreement. So it's something that absolutely should be on the agenda within the talks and kind of first and foremost in the minds of world leaders. It's in there in the text, kind of specifically saying that kind of national governments, when they're setting their climate ambitions and their decarbonisation targets, that they should have regard to the kind of quality and the quantity of jobs being created and the impact, positive and negative, in that sense. And we can see some kind of good examples of leadership pre-COP in this regard, kind of particularly relevant for these talks. The Scottish Government in 2019 set up a Just Transition Commission, bringing together experts to set recommendations and really guide government action on this. And I think that's something that it would be positive to see more countries and more governments explicitly kind of setting up these commissions. We've seen a lot of, I guess, increasing commentary and increasing where the kind of concept of the just transition is sneaking into the way in which politicians are talking about it. So you look at kind of Biden and the infrastructure growth plans in the US, a lot of that is underpinned by the thinking of the just transition, but we're just maybe not quite at the point where people are happy labeling it as that and talking about it really proactively. And I think it's really important that we make that next step so that kind of investors, wider stakeholders, citizens really understand what it is we're talking about and really see that it's not a zero-sum game between environmental sustainability and social equality. You can achieve both of those hand in hand.
Completely agree with you, Kate. And Sophie, I don't know if you've got a few thoughts on expectations for policymakers during COP.
Yeah, so I think earlier we talked about the different levels that you can think about the just transition on, and one of those is countries. And I think that the really relevant issue here is around kind of climate financing support for developing nations. And we saw this is really kind of front of mind right now with India announcing their net zero by 2070 commitment earlier in the week, and them calling for climate financing levels to be 10 times the level that they currently are. And I think that's a really important piece that we want to try and see agreed at COP26 within the next couple of weeks, a commitment to climate financing and hopefully a ratcheting up of existing kind of climate financing that was committed in the Paris Agreement.
Thanks very much, Sophie. That has been one of the key issues and flashpoints of COP26 so far, but hopefully by the time we've finished our series, we'll have further progress towards that rather elusive $100 billion target. We're coming perhaps towards the end of our podcast today. I suppose very mindful that a lot of those listening in will be UK CIF members, so asset managers, pension funds, IFAs, and others touching on sustainable finance in the UK. Kate, I don't know if you've got 1 or 2 final messages for our members on how they can consider this issue and perhaps start to integrate the just transition into some of their thinking and decision making.
Well, first step, if it's for members who are kind of new to this concept, would really be to start breaking down some of those silos that we often have in place. We think about ES&G issues, so environmental, social and governance, and we often think about those in isolation. And the key point of the just transition is that kind of when we talk about sustainability, all of these issues are interdependent. So we need to start thinking about kind of climate change in the context of human rights, about decent work in the context of kind of low carbon technology. So I think that's very much the first step of moving out of the silos that we've perhaps got a little bit complacent about thinking in, and taking that more holistic view of how these different factors interconnect.
Thanks very much, Kate. Sophie, any final messages for UK SIF members to take away?
Yeah, so I think, we've touched on a lot of the practical things that investors can do already, but I would encourage members to think, as I said, just not just about the kind of, high carbon impact sectors, but really integrating this into any kind of engagement that they're doing. We're all going to have to move as we see the move to a low carbon transition. So it's really important that it becomes embedded in the questions that we're really asking of companies, much broader than just those high carbon intensive sectors.
Thanks so much, Sophie. And thanks so much, Kate. I think that brings us to the end of our conversation, unfortunately. I've really enjoyed chairing this discussion, and we've covered a lot of the ground. Just to say to our listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tune into our other episodes coming up throughout COP26 in Glasgow. You can find us on Twitter @UKSIF, all one word. Speak very soon. Thanks.